That's a closed runway. That'll work, sir. We're getting the equipment off the runway.
It was in the 1900s. Boeing had just unleashed the 747, the beast of the skies, the dragon of the wind, and the shadow behind the clouds. Taking that on was not just impossible. It was equally meant to remain in your imagination. And somewhere in the noise and thunder of this aviation arms race, McDonnell Douglas had a choice to make. Sit quietly, dream on, and watch the market slip away, or take a swing that could either elevate them to dominance or drag them into disaster. The answer was the DC-10. On paper, it seemed smart, even genius. Instead of chasing the massive four-engine layout of the 747, Douglas decided to go leaner, meaner, and more versatile. The DC-10 would be a trijet, 3 engines instead of 4. That meant less fuel burn, less weight, and potentially cheaper maintenance. It would seat around 250 passengers, not 400, but it didn't need to. Most airlines couldn't even fill a 747. The DC-10 would fit perfectly between the bulky jumbo and the aging narrow-body fleets. But it wasn't just about seating. Douglas had something Boeing didn't: experience with trijets. Their DC-8 was still flying strong, and the success of the smaller twin-engine DC-9 gave them confidence. The DC-10, they believed, would be the sweet spot of the skies: long enough range for transcontinental flights, big enough for international routes, but small enough for flexibility. And, crucially, they'd get it to market faster than Lockheed's TriStar, which was already running into development delays. So Douglas pushed the throttle forward. There was one major customer they needed to convince: American Airlines. The airline had approached both McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed with the same request to build a wide-body jet that could fly coast to coast, carry 250 passengers, and cost less than a 747. Lockheed responded with the L-1011, a technological marvel with Rolls-Royce engines and futuristic avionics. But Douglas made a different pitch. They could deliver sooner and cheaper. Time was everything. Every month without a wide-body jet meant lost profits. American Airlines didn't need perfection. They needed a plane that flew, and Douglas promised exactly that. In 1968, McDonnell Douglas officially launched the DC-10 program. And from the beginning, it was clear they weren't building a plane, they were building a statement. The aircraft would carry 2 engines under the wings and 1 in the tail, built into the vertical stabilizer. It would have 2 aisles, spacious interiors, and a slick, modern look that made passengers feel like the future had arrived. Airlines from around the world placed orders: Delta, United, Air France, Lufthansa. Even non-US carriers wanted in, and for a while, it worked. Douglas was faster than Lockheed, cheaper than Boeing. Their factories were humming. Their boardrooms were cheering. By 1971, the DC-10 was ready for its first commercial flight with American Airlines. A new wide body had entered the sky, and the future looked bright. It was sleek. It was fast. It filled a niche the 747 couldn't. It made Lockheed sweat. But here's the thing. When you rush to market, something always gets left behind. Sometimes it's Polish. Sometimes it's reliability. Sometimes it's safety. Buried beneath the applause and the contracts was a truth no one wanted to face. Douglas had taken shortcuts. Corners had been shaved. Design choices had been made not by engineers, but by accountants. The cargo door, a detail so small it was barely mentioned in brochures, had a flaw that engineers warned about, a flaw that would be ignored. And when it finally gave way, it wouldn't just cost lives, it would cost Douglas its reputation, its dominance, and eventually its independence. But back then, in those early days, the DC-10 wasn't a mistake. It was a marvel, a middle finger to Boeing. And for just a moment, it looked like the future. Success is a cruel thing. It feeds you champagne in public and then hands you a ticking bomb in private.
Presenting an American dream. For years, American Airlines has dreamed of having a quiet plane with virtually smokeless engines, as comfortable as a 747 but able to land at almost any commercial airport. Introducing the new DC-10 luxury liner with a lounge and coach and first class. American DC-10. Our passengers get the best of everything.
You get the best of everything.
By the early 1970s, McDonnell Douglas had exactly what it wanted. The DC-10 was in service. Orders were rolling in. Airlines praised its fuel economy. Passengers loved its quieter cabin. But inside the engineering teams, deep in the places where numbers don't lie and optimism isn't currency, there was concern. They had moved too fast, and in aerospace, fast is expensive. But worse, fast is dangerous. The cracks weren't always obvious. They didn't scream, they whispered. One of the earliest and most critical whispers came from something absurdly simple: the cargo door. Most aircraft at the time used plug-type cargo doors. They opened inward and used the pressure difference at altitude to hold themselves shut. But Douglas had other plans. Their door would open outward. Why? Because it saved space in the cargo hold. You could pack more freight. More freight meant more revenue. That tiny design decision gave airlines a competitive edge, and it gave Douglas another checkmark on the sales pitch. But outward opening doors come with a trade-off. They require mechanical locking mechanisms strong enough to resist cabin pressure from the inside. This meant latches, actuators, and electrical sensors had to perform perfectly every single flight. Except they didn't. In 1970, during a ground test in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, the cargo door on an American Airlines DC-10 blew off. It wasn't in the air. No one was killed. But the cargo door failed catastrophically. The floor of the cabin above collapsed under decompression force. Seats tore loose. Flight attendants were thrown like paper. The warning signs couldn't have been louder. Douglas issued a fix. They added instructions for stronger pins, added placards for ground crews, changed the maintenance manual, but they did not redesign the door. Why? Because re-engineering that part of the aircraft would have been expensive, time-consuming, and worst of all, public. It would have signaled that something fundamental was wrong with the plane. Orders might have been canceled, confidence shaken. So, they rolled the dice, again.
What they do is they build in multiple redundancies to make sure the door is properly latched and does not open. And you build it in to a point of that it's extremely improbable that the door would ever open.
And that wasn't the only compromise. To meet deadlines, Douglas had split responsibilities between subcontractors. Different parts of the plane were being built by different companies, fuselage sections here, engine mounts there. In theory, this made production faster. In practice, it meant miscommunication, inconsistency, and a growing pile of engineering debt. Take the engine pylon design, the assembly that attaches the engines to the wings. It required precise procedures during maintenance. But unlike Boeing's designs, which allowed for easy, full-unit removal, the DC-10's layout made things trickier. One wrong jolt from a forklift or improper hoisting could compromise a critical bolt or crack a fitting. That wouldn't be fully understood until it was too late. Internally, some engineers raised concerns. Reports were filed. Warnings were given, but they were buried under pressure. Douglas was racing Lockheed for market share. Every delay could hand victory to the L-1011. So, the warnings stayed in drawers. The clock kept ticking, and the DC-10 kept flying. To passengers, the plane looked fine, comfortable, modern, safe. But inside its skin, behind the smiles of flight attendants and the glow of seatbelt signs, was a jet held together by cost calculations and political urgency. It was a plane designed to win a market, not a plane designed to survive its own shortcuts, and the price would come later, loud, violent, and public. Because you can only ignore the whispers for so long. Eventually, they scream. It happened at 11:32 a.m., June 12, 1972. American Airlines Flight 96 was climbing out of Detroit Metropolitan Airport, bound for Buffalo. It was just another routine leg in a perfectly average day. Until it wasn't. At 12,000 feet, a sound shattered the cockpit, a gut-punching explosion followed by a violent shudder. The rear cargo door had blown off mid-air. In an instant, the cabin floor above collapsed. Control cables routed beneath the floor snapped. Pilots lost partial control. The rudder jammed. Elevator response went haywire. The cockpit crew wrestled with an aircraft that no longer listened to them, and yet, they landed it. By sheer skill and luck, the DC-10 touched down safely. No one died. But the industry had just been handed a red warning flag soaked in jet fuel. The cause? That cargo door, the same one that had failed on the ground 2 years earlier. The same design, the same weakness. Only this time, it had nearly killed everyone on board. Douglas responded with a mix of patchwork solutions and public reassurance. Locking mechanisms were updated, instructions revised. Airlines were told the issue had been addressed, but it hadn't. 2 years later, on March 3, 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 took off from Paris-Orly en route to London. It was a full flight, 346 souls aboard. Minutes after departure, as the plane climbed through 11,000 feet, the cargo door failed again. This time, there was no luck, no partial control, no miracle. The decompression ripped the fuselage open. The floor above collapsed, severing all control cables. There was no mayday call, no time to react. The jet slammed into the Ermenonville forest outside Paris at nearly 500 miles per hour. Everyone on board went home to the Lord Jesus. It was the deadliest aviation disaster the world had ever seen at that point. Investigators arrived at the wreckage to find twisted metal, charred earth, and a horrifying truth. The warnings had been ignored. Douglas had known the problem existed. They'd proposed a fix, a vent to equalize pressure and prevent the floor collapse, but never implemented it. Not mandatorily, not globally, not when it mattered.
Roger, sir. That's a closed runway. That'll work, sir. We're getting the equipment off the runway, and they'll line up for that one.
How long is it?
6,600 feet, 6,600, and the equipment's coming off.
Isolate this.
The world turned on the DC-10. Airlines panicked. Passengers canceled bookings. News anchors asked if the aircraft should be grounded. Safety regulators across multiple countries opened emergency investigations. The FAA, which had once defended the aircraft, was now under fire for approving a known design flaw. The illusion of safety was gone. And this was just the beginning. Because while the cargo door was the first nail in the coffin, it wasn't the last. 2 years later, another nightmare struck. American Airlines Flight 191. It was May 25, 1979. Chicago O'Hare. The DC-10 had just lifted off when the left engine separated from the wing. It flipped up and over, crushing hydraulic lines and severing key systems. The plane rolled violently, nose up, then dipped left and crashed into a nearby trailer park in a fireball of aviation fuel. All 271 people on board died. 2 more on the ground. This wasn't a cargo door. It was a maintenance flaw, a direct result of how the DC-10's engine pylons were attached. Douglas's design required delicate handling during removal. American Airlines maintenance crews, under time pressure, had developed a shortcut using a forklift. That shortcut damaged the wing pylon. The damage wasn't visible, but on takeoff, with full thrust and vibration, it failed catastrophically. In response, the FAA grounded every DC-10 in the US. The first time in history a commercial jet had been pulled from the skies after being certified and operational. For Douglas, this was no longer about bad luck or tragic coincidence. It was a reckoning. The DC-10's flaws weren't isolated. They were systemic. And the world had finally noticed. By the early 1980s, the DC-10 was no longer just an aircraft. It was a symbol, not of innovation, but of risk mismanaged, warnings ignored, and aerospace ambition backfiring in public view.
Good evening. The worst air crash in American history took place today. An American Airlines DC-10 with 279 people aboard lost power during a takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. It plunged 2,000 feet to the ground and everyone was killed. 3 on the ground were slightly injured. O'Hare, filled with holiday travelers, was closed briefly. It was American Airlines Flight 191 bound for Los Angeles. The airline says an engine malfunctioned on takeoff. Witnesses said the engine fell off. 279 dead, a great tragedy.
The fallout from Flight 191 was nuclear. Public trust didn't just dip, it cratered. Airlines scrambled to distance themselves from the DC-10 brand. Passenger bookings dropped. Some flights were quietly switched to other aircraft models just to avoid the backlash. Douglas spent millions on PR campaigns, reassuring the public the jet was now safe, but the damage had been done. Not just to the plane's reputation, but to the company's very core. Because when you gamble on speed, cost, and market share over safety, you don't just bet the airplane, you bet the company. Internally, McDonnell Douglas was bleeding. Engineering talent began to drift away. Morale tanked. Resources that should have gone into future projects were now being funneled into retroactive fixes, litigation settlements, and damage control. Government regulators swarmed the industry, lawsuits piled up, congressional hearings spotlighted every corner that had ever been cut. The phrase "designed by deadline" became a quiet insult in aerospace circles, and it always pointed at the DC-10. But the market wouldn't wait. Boeing's 747 was booming. Lockheed, despite struggling with its own L-1011 program, still looked cleaner by comparison. Even Airbus, the European upstart, had started pushing into wide-body territory with the A300. Meanwhile, McDonnell Douglas, once a titan of American aviation, found itself playing catch-up with a broken ankle. By the late 80s, the company tried to pivot. The MD-11, an evolved DC-10, was launched with better engines, longer range, and modern avionics. But the stink of its predecessor lingered. The MD-11 never truly shook off the shadow of its origin story. Airlines were cautious, orders were tepid, and worse still, early deliveries failed to meet promised performance specs. It was the DC-10 all over again, a good idea half-executed and overpromised. In 1997, with debt mounting, innovation stalling, and competitors surging ahead, McDonnell Douglas was acquired by Boeing. On paper, it was called a merger. In reality, it was a burial. The Douglas name disappeared from aircraft tales. The design teams were absorbed. The legacy was folded into a competitor it once tried to dethrone. The DC-10 did fly for decades. It served as a cargo hauler, a tanker, even a firefighting platform. Pilots who flew it often described it as stable and powerful when it worked. But history doesn't care about how a plane lands. It remembers how a plane fails. And the DC-10 failed loud enough to leave scars on the entire industry. So what's the real cost? Not just the hundreds of lives lost in accidents that could have been prevented. Not just the billions burned trying to patch holes that should never have existed. The true cost was trust. Trust in engineering. Trust in the certification process. Trust in the belief that the race to innovate wouldn't come at the price of basic safety. The DC-10 was born out of a rush to compete. It wanted to be faster, cheaper, and more profitable than anything Boeing had. But it forgot the one principle that governs flight more than any other. You don't cheat physics. You don't bargain with pressure differentials. You don't negotiate with gravity. And when you try to, gravity always wins. The DC-10 was meant to carry a new era into the skies. Instead, it became a cautionary tale etched in black boxes and twisted wreckage. A plane that tried to beat Boeing and paid the price, one broken bolt at a time.